Fauna Consortium, which also my lab is part of, which is a consortium that's trying to exploit natural analogs of future climate to study the impact of climate change on in general, marine ecosystem. And maybe some of you are aware, but Jason is the godfather of natural analogs. He was one of the first that published paper, very nice paper in Science Nature, by showing the power of natural analogs of future climate to study the impact of marine, the impact of climate change on marine life. So we're really lucky to have him here. And today we'll talk about some work that is doing mostly in UK.
All over the place.
All over the world. Okay, Jason, please.
Thank you very much. So yes, thanks, Tim. So as you can see in the background there, I've got a picture of the marine station that's in Plymouth, which is one of the oldest in the world, 1883, and several Nobel Prize winners have worked there. For example, on how nerves work, how memory works. So it's an iconic place to do marine biology. But I'm working for 2 months per year at the University of Scuba, although of course for the last 3 years it's been impossible to get into the country. But yeah, I'm there for a long-term sabbatical now. I'm there till Christmas and returning again in March. Okay, let me kick off just with this picture, just showing the type of work that Tim was talking about using these natural analogs. I was lucky on a deep sea research trip in Italy to take a day off halfway through the cruise for tourism, and we went to this island Ischia that's got these bubbles coming up to the seabed. They didn't actually know at the time what the bubbles were, but I thought, well, if it's carbon dioxide, this would be an excellent way of looking at which organisms can survive in high CO2 conditions. But I'm not going to be talking about this research much here now, because we recently had an ICONA symposium where I gave an overview of CO2 research. But there is a little aspect of the work that I'll mention now, because I think it's new to what we talked about in the ICONA meeting, which is this work using plastic bottles to see what the effect of increasing CO2 is on the plastisphere, this consortium of organisms that live on plastics. So basically what we did was we put the bottles into reference conditions, and along these IPCC concentration pathway scenarios, exceeding current day values of CO2 and back down to present day levels. And we saw that, yes, increased CO2 definitely affects the microbiology of what lives on these plastics. Now, there's a new piece of work that we're doing. This is out for review at the moment with some Chinese collaborators at Xiamen University, which is on the south coast of China. And they've got this mesocosm system here, which is excellent if you don't happen to have a volcano emitting CO2 through the seabed. Instead, you can put the CO2 into these very large test tubes and work out what's happening to the plankton. So I took advantage of this system to put plastic bottles into there. And I'm a bit embarrassed because I know that lots of you work on the genetics of what's going on in the sea. I don't. All I did was put plastic bottles into these bags. Some other people produced this piece of work, but it amazed me the diversity of organisms that would quickly settle in just 1 month on these bottles. Now, the HC is high carbon and the AC is ambient carbon levels. And you can see just by looking at those histograms, there's a change in the community at the high carbon treatment. And in just 32 days, fantastic, thank you. In just 32 days, we got 25 different types of bacteria and related organisms, but also 26 types of eukaryotic organisms, which I thought was pretty amazing. And lots of the phyla that were recorded on the bottles are very, very seldom studied, things that are quite obscure in the literature and hardly studied at all. And unfortunately, what this piece of data is showing is that the high CO2 actually enriched human pathogens on the plastics. So that combination of plastic pollution in the water, which I know you've got a lot of around here, plus the fact that ocean acidification can increase the proliferation of human pathogens, is a bad combination. Okay. So that's this bit of work that isn't published yet, and I thought I'd share it with you because it's kind of new. Okay, so Moving away now really from ocean acidification, I'd like to give you a bit of background to the types of studies I've done in the past, because they've been quite varied. And it's just a joy to be able to share them with you. So this is some work we did above the Arctic Circle on an island called Lofoten. Is this a pointer? How does it work? It doesn't matter. This is Norway, obviously, and there's islands here, which is Lofoten Island. Thank you very much. And it's a place where the seabed gets deep very quickly, a bit like Okinawa. So you can see, I'm trying to point it, but I can't. But you can see it gets from 200 meters deep, which is the light blue, down to 2,000 meters deep, which is the dark blue. So it's a steep slope here. And we were able to use a ship called Polarstern. I don't know. I don't really want. I've got another clip coming up later that somebody who's comical on the boat put some crazy music behind, and I'd like to silence that. So I'm going to look at a way of silencing it. Sound. Off. Not 100%. You don't want this sort of 70s rock music. Okay, where were we? So this ship is an icebreaker. So it's got two hulls instead of one, and it's egg-shaped, okay, instead of V-shaped, so that if it gets stuck in the ice won't crush the hull, it will just lift the hull out of the water. Now, this ship was amazing. It had helicopters, so it's got a helicopter on board. It also had a manned submersible, which we were able to use to go down and look at this steep part of the seabed. So here's an acoustic image of the seabed there. And on the right-hand side, you've got 200 meters deep. On the left-hand side, you've got the dark blue, which is 2,000 meters deep. And these strange amphitheaters of the edge of the continental shelf, which have actually caused big tsunamis in the past because the area is unstable. What's happening with Norway is that there used to be 1 kilometer thickness of ice on the top of Norway, which is now melted, which is causing something called isostatic rebound, which means that Norway is moving upwards out of the sea. And in these steep areas, the edge of the continental shelf sometimes falls down and causes tsunamis. Not often, every few thousand years, but you can still see that this is quite obvious what's going on here. What's not obvious is what these lines are on the continental shelf. Does anyone know what they might be? Yeah. Exactly right. Yes, they're iceberg scour marks. But when I was on the ship, I didn't know this. I thought they were fishing marks, but it's not. You're exactly right. So as the icebergs move across the continent, they gouge out channels on the surface there. Then they gouge, and as they melt, they release big stones that drop through the water onto the seabed. So here's the picture of this submersible we used, which was really quite funny because you've got to squeeze your shoulders together in order to get down through the tube at the top. And then this chap releases you from the ship and off you go. It's battery operated. It's not connected to the ship at all. So it's a bit disconcerting. You're like, well, what if the batteries run out? And this is the image we saw on the seabed, which I thought was pretty fantastic, right? I did not expect to see a giant coral reef. Actually, that coral reef extends for 24 kilometers along this piece of seabed here. And at the time, nobody knew that coral reefs could occur in Arctic waters. So this was quite a major discovery. And what's at the bottom here is a scleractinian coral, a dead scleractinian, and above it are some really quite large, maybe this tall, gorgonian corals. Really, really good. So basically, the textbooks at the time were wrong, and they tend to say that coral reefs only occur in warm waters and in shallow waters where there's enough light. But actually, if you go to museums like the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, half the coral diversity that's in that museum is made up of these non-photosynthetic corals. Actually, corals, only half of them have got symbiotic algae. The rest, a big diversity, don't. So these ones, they don't need light. They can live in very cold water, down to 4 degrees centigrade. If you carbon date the reef itself, it could be thousands of years old. Obviously, it can't be older than the last ice age, because in the last ice age, the coast of Norway was frozen. Wonderful colors, diverse creatures, really, really interesting. So here's a little video clip of what we saw. Now, you'll notice the window on this submersible is quite big. So on that type of submersible, it can only dive to a maximum of 500 meters. Otherwise, it would implode because it's got these big windows. This was in summer, so that's June 2007. And this trip was the only time I've been in a manned submersible. So I was very, very lucky and pleased to do this. And can you see on the seabed there, it's absolutely full of corals. So it's a bit like being on a coral reef here, except there's only 3 species of coral making this reef. Whereas, of course, if you go to a coral reef here, there's many, many species. But despite the low diversity of coral species, there's a huge diversity of associated fauna. So lots of different types of sponges, for example, or lots of different types of echinoderms. And these fish that are swimming around, these are commercially important species of fish, as in we eat them. So that can make these deep water reefs vulnerable. Can you see, I can't see from this angle, but hopefully you can see some zooplankton in the water, okay? They're the reason that that reef is there. So they don't need to feed using symbiotic algae. They're actually feeding heterotrophically, using their stinging tentacles to capture the zooplankton that are passing by. That rope there is the only evidence of fishing damage I saw on this fantastic reef. It's a hemp rope, so it's obviously an old one because people use plastic these days. And the coral has grown over that rope, so we know it's been there a long time. So very little evidence of any damage to this reef. And this camera is going to now zoom in on one of my favorite organisms. It's called a basket star. I don't know if you've heard of those, but they've got, it's like a brittle star, except each arm branches many times. You get them in the tropics in shallow water, but in cold countries like the UK or Norway, they're only in the deep sea. So I've never seen them on a wetsuit dive. This was the only time I've seen them, apart from in textbooks, on the submersible. Now we collected one of these, put it in a bucket, and we saw it rip the head off a fish. Okay, so it's a highly, highly carnivorous organism. So if you're an unfortunate fish, because of course we're using lights to illuminate this, but it's mesophotic, there's very little light. So it's possible that a fish could get caught and killed by this. There's me with my young face, so happy to have done this submersible dive. And if you're looking for opportunities to get on these cruises, anybody, then the Alfred Wagner Institute does have places on board ships for research scientists that can join and collaborate. So quite young people can get on board and get this experience if you want it. So here's a few different pictures of the fish you get on the Norwegian reef. This one's called brosmi. Brosmi, it tastes fantastic. It's a bit like a cod. It's a cold water fish though, so you don't get them in the UK. You might recognize this fish, the cod, okay, because it's got that barbel there. Delicious fish, very important to the economy of Norway. Now, given that we saw these fish hiding and feeding and breeding in these reef systems, then of course you want to protect those reefs for the sustainability of the fishery going forwards. Same with this fish here. This one is one that has it bears live young. So unlike most fish like cod that release their eggs and sperm into the water, these actually brood their young. You can see them brooding in amongst the reef. Now, of course, if you've got commercially important species of fish in high densities, that attracts fishermen. This is a cartoon from Canada, actually. It's showing glass sponge reefs. So these glass sponges, as the name suggests, are very, very fragile. And if they get hit by the doors of these trawls, they get smashed to pieces. Now, fishermen hate damaging their fishing gear, okay? So if you drag a net through a coral reef, that causes extensive damage to the fishing nets. So they don't try and do this, but it happens inadvertently when they get as close as possible to the reef, but make a mistake, and then they can cause some damage. So I was involved in another expedition that used a very famous French ROV called Victor. It's a really huge machine with a team of French technicians that work 24 hours around the clock, 8 people per shift, so that it's working all the time. Really, really amazing piece of equipment. There it's doing an acoustic image of the seabed as well as photographs to see what's down there. And unfortunately, what we saw off the coast of Scotland and off the coast of Ireland is really extensive fishing damage to these deep sea reefs. So before we even knew they existed, they're being damaged. So this is a fishing net. It's a plastic fishing net caught up in a coral reef, and it's ghost fishing because animals get caught in this net on the seabed, they die, and that attracts other animals to come and feed on the dead organisms. They also get caught, and it's perpetual. And of course, plastic doesn't rot, so it's going to be a problem going on for centuries in this particular location. And this is a video, not very good quality, but it's the best I've got, of a fishing net on the seabed that's been abandoned because it was caught up with lots of coral. Okay, so this is on the west coast of Ireland, maybe about 1,000 meters deep. And it's clear evidence, isn't it, that the fishing vessel has caused damage to the coral reef. Okay, it's caught up. So we're able to take this evidence to Brussels and say to the people in authority, look, this is what's happening. We really need to protect these deep sea reef systems because damage is happening now. And we picked up pieces of coral to carbon date them and show them this is broken by mankind. It's not broken by nature. It's been broken by a fishing boat. When I was between academic jobs, I worked on French fishing vessels up and down the west coast of Europe. And these are pictures showing the types of damage that can occur. So those are some of those glacial drop stones, they're called. It's when an iceberg takes a stone off the continent and drops it in the deep sea. Well, you can catch them in boats. The boats are so strong, they can lift up boulders this big, okay? It's a disaster when that happens because it macerates the fish. It makes the fish mush, so you can't sell them. So obviously the fishermen don't want to do this. And also it catches lumps of coral, sometimes the size of this lectern. Okay, you've got big lumps of coral coming up. And again, that rips open the fish. So obviously the fishermen don't want this to happen, but occasionally it does. So this paper is probably my most, the paper I'm proudest of. It's describing the fact that we're damaging these reefs up and down the west coast of Europe. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you've got a habitat type that's thousands of years old, and it's full of breeding fish. You can tell they're breeding because they're distended bellies, they're pregnant. Whereas on the right-hand side, you've got what happens after one single tow of a fishing net through the reef. Okay, so this is really, really bad, what's happening. And part of the problem we face is that people, perfectly reasonable people, can't really be persuaded that the deep sea is a place to care about. Okay? And part of the problem is that most people, nobody in this room probably, has been diving on a deep sea coral reef, maybe some exceptions. But it's difficult if you can't go and see something to care about it. But what I was impressed by was some of these single stones, these single glacial drop stones, were covered in organisms, many of which have yet to be described by scientists. Now, the Northeast Atlantic is one of the best known and studied parts of the planet in terms of marine biology, and yet there's still some organisms on that rock that we don't know what they are, okay? And we don't want to lose those. And so a good argument to make is that if you consider all the turtles, all the dolphins, all the rays, all the pelagic fish, there is nothing compared to the diversity of what lives on the seabed. Okay, so 98% of described marine species occur on the seafloor. So the seafloor is clearly an important place. Now here's a cartoon of the seafloor off the west coast of UK and Ireland. And I'm using this slide to illustrate the fact that it's not a boring, flat expanse of mud, which is what many people think the deep sea is. It's actually punctuated with all sorts of interesting geological features. So, I've got this working, no. Up above my finger here, there are 3 giant mountains, okay? Those mountains are there because the seabed up through that region, it's called the Rockall Trough, was being torn apart as the Atlantic was opening up. And it stretched the seabed so thinly that huge volcanoes punched up, magma punched up to the seabed to create these giant underwater mountains. Off the three volcanoes there, you've got big chunks of the old continental shelf that have been ripped off, so they form shoals. Now, these are really interesting places because they trap the diurnal migration of zooplankton. Zooplankton normally are terrified of being eaten when the sun comes up because the visual predators, the fish, will eat them. So what they do is they swim down in the daytime to escape, but they can't swim through a piece of the continental shelf. They get trapped. So just like the Grand Banks of Canada and the USA, these big banks off the coast of Europe in UK waters are incredibly rich fishing grounds, really, really important fishing grounds, because fishermen can catch the fish because the fish can't escape from they can't escape from the nets. Whereas if you were to tow a net in the deep water, 2,000 meters deep, you wouldn't catch any fish because they're not trapped at the surface. They're not feeding on the zooplankton on the surface of these banks. Something that is useful about having an old marine station in my city of Plymouth is there's lots and lots of books lined up over the centuries with data in them that have been collected over time. And you can go back to these books and start to extract some of that information and find out interesting things. So one interesting thing I found out from these books is that the diversity of corals off the UK is much lower in shallow water than it is in deep water. So for example, the Antipotherian corals, they used to be thought to have medicinal purposes, hence the name. They're also beautiful jewelry, very, very jet black coral skeletons. Only one of them occurs in shallow water, 10 species in deep. Same with the scleractinians. So that's one called the Devonshire cup coral. I'm from Devon, so that's a nice name. There's 32 species in deep water. Same with the gorgonians, 2 in shallow, 25 in deep. So something is important about these deep water areas. That's supposed to be a cartoon of a deep sea coral reef, okay, up on the right hand side there, and this is the continental shelf break. Now, one interesting thing about the continental shelf break region is this aragonite saturation horizon. Above that horizon, the water is saturated with calcium carbonate, but below that horizon, there's a lack of it. So if you were to take a piece of chalk, this university is too modern, it doesn't have any chalk. So pretend this is a piece of chalk. If you were to attach this to a fishing line and lower it off the side of the ship, you could go down to 2,000 meters deep and it'd be fine. And then beyond that depth, it starts to dissolve because you've gone beyond the aragonite saturation horizon. Okay, so that's one aspect. So the surface waters there have got lots of carbonate, and to make a coral reef, you need carbonate. Another interesting aspect is this stratification of the water. So there's different layers of water off the deep of the UK. I'm sure the same is true from the waters around Okinawa. You've got different layers of water depending on how cold and how salty they are. The densest water is cold and salty, so that's at the bottom, the northeast Atlantic deep water. On top, you've got the North Atlantic drift water, which has come over from the Gulf of Mexico. It's less dense because it's so warm. And very interestingly, you've got this Mediterranean intermediate water that comes out from the Straits of Gibraltar and spreads north and south up and down the coast of Europe. It doesn't float on the top, even though it's the warmest water, because it's got a lot of salt in it. It's about 38 parts per thousand, so it's intermediate. And we always find the coral reefs at that boundary between the Mediterranean intermediate water and the water below. You might say, well, why is that? There's some old papers like in Nature and so on saying that these coral reefs are probably there because of hydrocarbons being released from the seabed. But I'm pretty sure that's not the case because we haven't found any evidence from isotopes, which you would expect to be very clear if the food was coming from bacteria feeding on oil. But what you do see when you're in a submersible is you're going through water that's clear, and then suddenly you hit an area that's like minestrone soup. You've got lots and lots of zooplankton. And that's partly because you've got these nepheloid layers. I don't know if you know the term, but it's basically the density change in the water. Everyone knows you've got waves on the surface of the ocean, but you've also got waves internally, where these nepheloid layers are. And that concentrates the food and it increases turbulence on the continental shelf break. So it's bringing food at depth to these reef systems. Now, when you go to seamounts, you see the same thing happening. So if you go down the bank of a seamount by definition in this talk is over 1,000 meters high, a kilometer high. You get turbulence around that seamount because it's obviously a big lump in the way of an ocean current, and that brings food at depth to the organisms that are there, which of course attracts megafauna, things like turtles, tuna, whales, albatross, and people to these seamount systems. Now, the next slide is a bit like when you look at the sky at night and you see all of these stars. This is a bit similar, except you're looking into the sea and you can see all these thousands and thousands, this constellation of seamounts. So there's more than 33,000 seamounts, which are greater than 1 kilometer high. Less than 1% have ever been sampled, and less than 0.1% have ever been sampled in detail. So this obviously is something that is a future area for research. Because if you look at Japan, I guess your eye moves to wherever you live in the world when you look at these types of maps. You can see there's many, many, many seamounts that have never been sampled by anybody ever, or just off the coast of Japan. The yellow dots are showing you places where mankind has visited. So obviously there's a lot still to discover. Now, fishermen, though, have targeted some of these seamounts because what happens on the seamounts is that when some mesophotic fish are in breeding condition, they aggregate on the seamount together to release their milt and their eggs. And that obviously attracts fishermen. So you can see Hawaii there shows out really, really strongly as an area where there are lots and lots of tons of fish have been caught. These are all different types of mesopelagic fish. Okay, so RORH, for example, is the orange roughy. So the orange roughy is the top picture there. Okay, so that's what that looks like. It sits very nicely on a dinner plate. It's very delicious. It's very expensive, of course, because you've got to go a long way to sea to catch it. And this is looking at the total catches of these mesopelagic fish in all time since records began. And they add up to much, much less than the annual landings of other types of fish. So the total estimated seamount catch is between 2 to 2.5 million tons, whereas the annual marine landings of fish are 80 million tons. So nobody can argue that these fish are important for food sustainability, right? We don't need these fish on our plates. We don't need them. So I'm arguing really that these shouldn't be targeted. This is an iconic fish for Shimoda, where I work in Japan. You know, the golden eye, very, very tasty, but perhaps we don't really need it. Now, the traditional way in which we've been monitoring these offshore fisheries is either using the Navy or the Coast Guard, and occasionally using patrol aircraft to spot these fishing vessels. But nowadays, we've got satellites, right, which makes it much easier to monitor and protect areas of deep sea coral reefs offshore. The GPS satellite is obviously a global positioning system. Large fishing vessels, the type that go out to seamounts, now have to send a signal every 2 hours through this vessel monitoring scheme, okay, VMS. And that allows managers to help protect what's going on the seabed. Now, this is a set of data plotted of VMS transponder signals off the west coast of Scotland. Now, if you go out across the west coast of Scotland, it's shallow water until here. Then it gets deep because that's the continental shelf break. And these are the 3 huge volcanoes that I mentioned earlier. These are seamounts offshore. And then you go out further to the west and you've got that big bank, that rich fishing bank offshore. Now, there's a feature of that bank that's, I think, pretty interesting. This banana shape up here, you can see it's got no fishing, no fishermen are going there. They're also avoiding the deep water, but they're targeting the continental shelf break and the seamounts and the banks for the reasons I mentioned before. It concentrates fish. But there's a puzzle over why they miss out that banana shape. Until you ask fishermen, I've found over my career that if you talk to fishermen, you learn a lot. Okay, so this is a map they produced saying where they don't fish. And they don't fish in this area here because it's too dangerous. They can catch their nets and it can actually pull the vessel underwater and kill people because the net gets caught in the coral. That incidentally is a famous island off the west coast of the UK. I have to see some nods from the British people because we lost a court case with Greenpeace. The British government was fighting Greenpeace because Greenpeace said, well, you can't claim the oil and gas rights around this island if you're not protecting the seabed. And so they lost that court case because they were not protecting the seabed from the damage caused by fishing. It's quite interesting. And what they tried to do was put a military man on this island to prove that it was inhabitable. Because if you can prove the island is inhabitable, then you can claim it as your territory. But they weren't having any of this because he needed water, right? So no water, no food, he couldn't survive there. So I'm pleased with the fact that we've proved there was a problem with deep sea fishing causing damage, thousands of years worth of damage to long-lived habitats. But we also came up with a solution, which was to use the VMS information to persuade the fishermen, the fishing industry, that it was a good idea to have areas that were off limits to this type of tow fishing gear. And that's actually what's happened. So we've now got these boxes in red showing you protected areas. So the banana shape, the one I keep going on about, is now protected because it's got thick coral reefs on the seabed. And there's some others there as well that are now protected. And we know from VMS data that these protected areas are working because now they're avoiding those places because they know they're being watched by satellites. So this was a big success story, and it was a success mainly because the fishing industry was involved with designing the shape and the size and the duration of these protected areas. And we didn't call them marine protected areas either. We called them fisheries protection zones or something like that. Now, this is a map. These are two maps that are a little bit complicated, so I have to take some time to explain them to you. But they both relate to the aragonite saturation horizon that I mentioned before, the depth at which water becomes corrosive to chalk, well, to aragonite, technically. So the top map is from 1760, so that's before the Industrial Revolution and before we started emitting carbon dioxide. And I'll concentrate on that map first. The green triangles are showing you where you've got large deep sea coral reefs. So you can see, first of all, that the Atlantic, the North Atlantic in particular, has got a lot of deep sea coral reefs, whereas the Pacific, particularly around Japan, doesn't. Okay, there's a reason for that. If you also look at the depth of the aragonite saturation horizon, in the North Atlantic, it's down at 2,000 meters deep, whereas around Okinawa, it's much more near the surface, like 400 meters deep. So there's a big difference in the amount of calcium carbonate in the water between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And as a result, you get a lot more deep sea coral reefs in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, if you go forwards in time to the year 2100, what you see is the effect of ocean acidification, because what's happened there is a rapid shoaling of the aragonite saturation horizon worldwide. So it shot up. So in places like the UK, where it used to be down at 2,000 meters deep, it's now right up at about 100 meters deep. So all of those coral reefs are being exposed now to waters that are corrosive to their skeletons. This is a paper we did looking at where the coral reefs are around the UK and modeled it and also produced it based on real data, and where the aragonite saturation is going to be through the course of this century. And you can see that many of these coral reefs are going to be dissolved in the course of this century. So in the course of my daughter's lifetime, they're going to be dissolved. Whereas some of them aren't, because there's even if we burn all of the wood, all of the coal, all of the oil, all of the gas on Earth, there are some areas where it will not be possible to acidify the ocean to such an extent that those reefs will be at risk. So that is what we're telling the government. This is where you should put your energy into deep sea coral reef conservation in the areas we know they'll survive. So, for example, there's some triangles up here that I'm saying, please get some protection in those places from fishing damage, because those are the only reefs that are going to be able to survive the course of this century. So that's kind of important from a policy point of view. How am I doing for time?
Good.
Excellent. Okay. In that case, I've got time to talk to you about another type of carbonate seabed that I'm interested in, which is the stuff that's made by coralline algae. So if you go to any rock pool at low tide and have a look, you'll see what looks like pink paint in the rock pool. You've probably all seen that, right? Some of it is branched, like this, which can flex in the waves, but others is just solid on the bottom of the rock pool. And it's the coralline algae. Now, there's a particular type of coralline algae that lives unattached. It's not fixed to the rock, and it rolls around on the seabed. It's moved by the tides and the waves. And this, in Europe, is called merle. In the US, they often call them rhodoliths, okay? Obviously, red stones. But there is actually a difference between the two that's a bit pedantic. But for merle, if you snap it open, it doesn't have a stone inside. There's no stone or shell or nothing inside. Whereas with rhodoliths, there's almost always a stone inside. So they are different. But they're started to be used as synonyms. So there's a couple of species. You can kind of tell them apart a bit, depending on their pigmentation. When they're dead, they lose that pigmentation, and they either become grey or white or brown. And you get big beaches made of this material off the west coast of Ireland and Scotland. Beautiful beaches. It looks like the Caribbean. It's so white and pretty. Now, I did my PhD on the west coast of Scotland on this island here. And when you look at a satellite image of a coastline that looks like this, you can tell it's been recently affected by ice, okay? Because these are fields that were gouged out by glaciers. Okay, so you've got very, very deep water close to land. It's 200 meters deep just off the coast. And for that reason, a very, very early marine biology station was set up there in 1885. Okay, so it started off as a boat and eventually became some buildings. But they picked this place because they've got deep water very close to the land to study a wide variety of marine organisms. Now, if you look in a museum collection of what they collected back in the 1880s, here are some twiglets of that merle. Okay, so the top band is the old museum collection, and the bottom are the largest pieces I could find that are living there today. Okay, you can see they're much, much smaller, broken up. Okay, and these merle beds, when you carbon date them, are 8 to 10,000 years old. Very, very fragile. Now, good examples of these merle habitats are like this. Okay, so they're full of life, especially commercially important species of life like that edible crab. Okay, but each twiglet only grows at 1 millimeter per year, and it forms a habitat type that takes thousands of years to build up. So a lot of people don't know this, but they're the oldest habitat type we've got in the Northeast Atlantic. Okay, so they're very, very ancient types of seabed. The scallops and oysters and other organisms can actually detect the smell that's emitted by these types of seaweed, and it triggers their metamorphosis from being larvae to settling on the seabed, because these types of organisms don't want to settle in the deep sea. They want to settle in the coastal waters where there's more food. And so they know when they're close to this type of habitat. Now, if this kind of stuff is new to you, then it's not surprising, because here's a breakdown of the amount of money that goes in to funding marine biology research in different types of habitats. Okay, so here on the left is the global estimate of the total area. So these rhodolith beds are bigger than coral reefs, even much bigger than kelp forests, bigger than seagrasses, and bigger than mangroves. But then if you look at the funding and the numbers of studies, then they're almost unstudied, okay, compared to coral reefs, kelp forests, seagrasses, and mangroves. So if I was working at OIST, I would think, well, hang on a minute, there's obviously a gap here. It's wide open for interesting science and interesting research, because it's almost an open field that hasn't been touched by people. Okay, and so the funding, this information is taken from Web of Science based on the topics listed there, and the funding comes from just, I think, 3 places: European Union, NSF in the USA, and the Australian Research Council. So it's not complete, but it gives you a sense of the picture overall. And there's various reasons why you might want to study these habitats. So, for example, they're nursery areas for cod. They are spawning areas for herring in the Northeast Atlantic. So the kippers that we eat in Europe, the eggs are laid on these mealbed habitats. And when the herring are spawning, it's like the ocean comes to life. You've got all this activity because the birds are feeding on the herring that are there. The dolphins come in to feed on the shoals that are spawning on the mealbeds. The mealbeds are actually a very important part of the system. So this is another piece of work that I was asked to do by the Scottish government, which was to investigate whether fish farms were compatible with mealbed habitats, because they had some ecological models at the time that said that the waste feed and the feces from the farms would be blown over such a wide area that it wouldn't impact the seabed in a merle area, because mealbeds live in areas with oxygen-rich, fast-moving water. Anyway, so we went on diving to check this, and here's a picture taken underneath a fish farm, and you can see all of the merle is dead. Okay, none of it's pink, and you get an abundance of scavenging organisms. So this is a little video, which I think shows pretty conclusively the models were wrong. Oh, that's a shame. You're not going to get the video. I can't be bothered trying to find it either because it would be buried in my computer. But essentially, what you get is an abundance of waste food and feces under the farm that builds up because of the twig-like nature of the seabed. It's trapped. So even when the tide is flowing quickly, it's still trapped within the matrix. And they actually lace the food that they feed to the salmon with a veterinary medicine that is an organophosphate nerve poison. Is designed to kill crustaceans. Okay, so at the end of this video, I've got me picking up loads and loads of dead crabs from underneath the fish farm, killed by the feed of the salmon. Okay, so this is the models were clearly wrong, and it's not compatible to put fish farms over mealbeds because they're such a long-lived habitat type. Now, I'll just finish off really with a mention of my involvement with the COP process. So this is Conference of Parties. This was 26, which was held in Glasgow. That's why I was there. But they had a more recent one. Sylvain was there, and I think Ricardo was there in Egypt, where they were shouting about the problems people are causing to shallow water coral reefs. So I opened my talk at the COP26 with this image of the ocean, which I like, and it's in this book, which I need to plug, which is Japanese Marine Life. Okay, so if you are interested in Japanese marine life, but you can't read Japanese, then this textbook is available. And it's got that image of the seabed showing that it's one ocean. Okay, there's a campaign going on amongst colleagues of mine to try to stop people calling them different oceans, like the Pacific Ocean or whatever. We should really be calling them the Pacific Basin, the Atlantic Basin, and so on, because they are interconnected. And what we do to the ocean is interconnected. So, for example, plastics, that's interconnected. You can put them in one place and they'll end up in another. So my talk was started off being about this deadly trio of problems, warming, acidification, and deoxygenation, because when you warm up water of any type, it drives off the gases that are contained. So if you warm up a bottle of Coca-Cola, it's going to drive off the CO2. If you keep the Coca-Cola in the fridge, it will keep the CO2 inside. And what we've done already is irreversible. For centuries. We've already put so much heat into the ocean, so much CO2 into the ocean, that we can't stop deoxygenation happening in some parts of the world. But what we can do is stop making it worse. So there are these blue carbon habitat types that are famous, the salt marsh, seagrass, and mangrove habitats that are the best understood. So the IPCC knows about these habitats and encouraging nations to start to look after these habitats because they're stores of carbon. And they're good because, well, for example, the people that live in this area, which is near Bristol in the UK, wanted to let the seawater to come in and flood the land so that the salt marsh would grow up and in effect protect them from sea level rise, because it becomes more resilient as the seabed rises, as the salt marsh grows. So there's adaptation through flood defense, and there's also mitigation through containing and absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So these are good habitats to protect. Now, I went to a meeting in Monaco to prepare for COP26, where they split us. It was a bit like the same sort of numbers as people as in this room. They split us into 4 groups. There were 2 marine biologists, 2 lawyers, and 2 economists in each group. And we had to discuss, in our case, it was discussing tropical blue carbon. Another group discussed deep sea blue carbon. Another group discussed temperate blue carbon. And I can't remember what the other group discussed, but that's what we did. In my group, it was tropical blue carbon. And I asked the economists to give me the worst example they can think of mismanagement of tropical blue carbon resources. And they didn't say anything, but they went away that night and came back the next day and reported on this particular problem with mangroves. So they said that Nigeria has got the worst possible combination of problems going on, because there's been, thanks to multinational oil companies like Shell, there's been hundreds of major oil spills. These aren't little oil spills, they're big ones, right next to the mangroves, okay? So 1.5 million tons of crude oil have been spilt in the mangroves of Nigeria. This is what it looks like, it's a mess, okay? That would have been an area which the local people would have relied upon for food, right? That's where you get your fish from, where you get your shellfish from. So in rural communities, life expectancy there has fallen by 14 years in just 2 generations, which is pretty bad, okay? And if that's not bad enough, it turns systems that should be sinks and stores for carbon into systems that emit greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. These start to come out of a mangrove system when you degrade it, okay? So obviously things are going wrong there. And in the discussions at that meeting in Monaco, it was becoming obvious that the needle has gone past blue carbon being just about salt marshes, seagrasses, and mangroves into other types of marine carbon stores. And this is very new types of research, and maybe something that OISTU get involved with, which is assessing carbon stores in other types of habitat. So shelf seas store more carbon than the coastal vegetated areas because they cover such vast areas. Now there's some places, like off the Outer Hebrides, up here, which don't store any carbon. Okay? If you take samples of the seabed and burn it, you won't find any carbon there because there isn't any. Whereas other places that are more muddy, like that big patch of red, that's a muddy type of seabed. There's a lot of carbon in that seabed because kelp forests, for example, when in the winter they break down, that carbon is exported offshore and ends up being accumulated in sediments. We need to start to think about this in terms of inventories of carbon stores in different nations' marine habitats. So back to Merle here. This is a scallop which likes to live buried in the Merle because it can feed upon the very, very food-rich water that's at the interface between the seabed and the water above it. It's buried in the Merle there. And to get it out, people use these dredges. Okay, so these teeth are 10 centimeters long and they dig into the seabed to excavate the scallops. Hopefully this will work. Maybe not. Oh, good, it is working, good. So you can see that scallop dredge going along the seabed causing a lot of damage to the seafloor. Okay, so if you're a piece of Merle that's growing 1 millimeter per year and you get buried by a dredge, you're not getting any light and it kills you. Okay, we did this research over a 7-year period. We found that one passage of a dredge caused far more than 7 years worth of damage because you could still see the track 7 years later. And new research has come out, not from my group, but from others, that what happens when you do this is you release carbon from the seabed. And actually fishing with towed gear is thought to emit more carbon than the entire aviation industry of the world. Okay, so clearly that's an important thing that no one's had their eye on, but needs to be considered. And something else that annoys me is the UK likes to brag that it's got 1/3 of its waters protected. There's a campaign internationally called 30 by 30, 30% of the ocean protected by the year 2030. Now the UK has done this, well, it's done it on maps. Oh dear, what's happened? Tim, help. Okay. It's done it on maps, but this type of activity is still allowed in 95% of them, so they're not really protected areas, are they? Good, so just finishing now. because I've done a lot of different types of work over time, I've realized that talking to people like lawyers and economists is more important than just talking to fellow marine biologists, which I have done for 20 years. But now I realize that actually you need to not just tell them, you need to tell people outside your particular bubble, because everybody knows that I worked on scallop dredges and it's bad for the seabed, I think, until I talk to people outside marine biology. So there's this organization called the International Programme for the State of the Ocean. It's actually just a group of like-minded scientists and economists and social scientists that have got together to say, well, what do we do about this? How do we get the message out more widely? And so there's this recent paper about 8 fundamental things we need to do to turn things around and start causing less damage to the health of the ocean. And I'll give you 4 of them here. What was very obvious at the COP26 meeting, and on the news I saw it, the same thing happened at the COP27 meeting, is that the most abundant numbers of people there, the most lobbyists and the most campaigners there were working for the oil industry, right? That shouldn't be happening at a COP meeting, which is all about how do we reduce CO2 emissions, right? And they actually get subsidies. The British, for example, are subsidizing hydrocarbon exploration in the deep sea. We shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't also be overfishing things or causing sewage pollution. I've learned from Tim there's a problem here with mismanagement of the soil. So the soil is causing damage to the coral reefs. That's not going to be turned around easily, but it has to be worked upon with urgency. There's this 30 by 30 scheme where we need 30% of the ocean to be fully protected or highly protected. A high seas treaty is needed because at the moment, in areas beyond national jurisdiction, there's no laws, no rules about what you can do. Okay, so it could be that mining corporations could just strip mine the seabed for rare earth metals with nobody stopping them because there's no rules at the moment. So that's needed. And we need active restoration of marine habitats. So, for example, even in places as beautiful as this, there are damaged parts of the coastline, which will have knock-on effect to the coral itself, which will have knock-on effects to the fish and to the people. So I think I'll end it there, and thanks, Tim, for inviting me. Don't tell them that, get them to buy it.
Or buy it. Okay, any question?
I'll go back to the map if you don't mind. Yeah. I can find it. Yeah. So all over the world, the aragonite saturation horizon is shoaling, and it's coming up like a train. It's really, really fast. It's never happened this fast in geological time. Even when great big extinctions occurred, like when a meteor struck, there was shoaling of the aragonite saturation horizon. And it killed the dinosaurs, but it didn't happen as quickly as it's happening now. And areas, like for example, these green triangles, at the moment, let's take Brazil. Off Brazil, they're in water that's super saturated with aragonite. Okay, so these skeletons I didn't mention, but the skeletons of scleractinian corals are made of aragonite. That is shoaling up, and look now, it's going to be up at 200 meters depth, not 2,000 meters depth. So all those coral reefs are exposed to corrosive waters. It doesn't matter where you go on the planet, the same thing's happening everywhere. So it's happening to the deep water corals that live off Okinawa, right? In the deep areas, the aragonite saturation is shoaling. Now, there is work that I've done that shows that corals, if you feed them, can survive in waters that are undersaturated with aragonite because they've got enough food. It'd be like you, if you went to the Arctic, if I give you enough Mars bars, you can survive, right? You can survive the cold. You've got lots of energy. So the corals in certain situations can survive, but they're dead skeletons. There's nothing keeping them alive. You know, they're dead. So they will dissolve. It's just, there's nothing else that can happen. They will dissolve. And unfortunately, a coral reef needs the dead skeletons to grow on. Okay, so if you lose that underneath, that will damage the habitat itself. So even though the corals in aquaria can be shown to survive ocean acidification, in the field, in real life, they won't because they'll lose the reef. Now, this is a phenomenon for mesophotic and deeper reefs, not the shallow water ones. So the ones you can see out the window, they'll be fine. There'll still be enough ragonite in the water, probably.
Right.
Thank you very much. About this coral reef in Arctic water. Like there is a lot of new oils, new oil mining stuff and gas mining in the Arctic. So how it could affect this deep coral reefs?
Well, I used to think, I worked at a university that was got a lot of money, research money through the oil industry. And I used to be of the opinion that they were the bad guys in terms of pollution of the seabed. But actually, I've since realized that actually their impact is tiny. You drill underneath the rig, you lubricate that with barium, so that does cause toxic problems, but the impact effect is very, very small, unless there's an accident. And so fishing actually is the big culprit, because it covers such a large area, whereas the oil industry is drilling small holes and not damaging large amounts of seabed. Of course, though, the CO2 emitted from extracting the oil is a different type and a big problem. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you.
So we have time for one more question.
I know that in the UK, particularly in terrestrial habitats, they always get lots of opponents from agricultural industries and sectors. Was it the same with the fisheries? Were you fighting with them to protect these areas, or
well, it
not
was
so much?
interesting in this case because we were dealing with a sector of the fishing industry. It's actually quite small. It was the offshore fishermen, types that would go very, very far out to sea. To do so, they need really big boats, okay, over 24 meters in length. And that's a small body of people. Not many people are doing this. And I was able to talk to their manager their representative, if you like, get around a table and just say, well, you don't want to be seen to be willfully damaging the seabed, do you? He went, no. But you do want to carry on catching fish, don't you? Yes. And you don't want to damage your gear, do you? No. So there's various reasons we could agree and get a solution that he was able to put his name to. And he said, well, this is a fisheries industry agreed set of off-limits areas. And part of the argument was, well, these habitats are used by fish to breed. So if you want your children's children to carry on fishing those fish, you need those breeding habitats. So it worked really well, actually. And it was helped a lot by having video showing the extent of the damage that was going on television at the time. So, you know, it was pushing it an open door, really. The problem with inshore fisheries, as you probably know, it's very diverse with lots of different people, lots of different interests, and difficult to get them all around one table to say, okay, we'll do this. So that was worked to my advantage. We were dealing with a small group of people. Yeah.
Any more questions? Okay. Well,
Have you talked to any Japanese fishermen?
We talk to them a lot because we have to work with them where we're working at the underwater volcanoes. So off Tsukine-jima, there's a series of 7 islands that are nothing to do with Tokyo. They're nothing to do with the mainland. They've got their own fisheries authority, and we have to work with them. They have to give us permission to, first of all, catch any fish we catch, or to work in the area. And what they didn't want was us to publicize the impact of the volcano on fisheries in case the fish they caught were bad for people. So we had to work with them a lot and persuade them that was the case. So yeah.
And so you looked at the direct effect of trawling and dredging, but have you looked, so when you do that, there is also like this sediment plume, right, that raises and that deposits then potentially on these habitats. Have you looked at this effect, this impact as well?
We did. Basically, we imagine that is the line that we use the dredge along. We put sediment collecting devices out on transects either side to see as you say, the area of picked up sediment impact. And it was basically 14 times the area of the track. So it's a big area that's covered and smothered. And that obviously clogs the gills of filter feeding organisms, and it smothers the surfaces of photosynthetic organisms. So it's a big impact. And that's research we did. Well, what's coming out that's new is the carbon side of the story, because of that carbon being released from what should be long-term stores. It's not something I ever thought about before, and it's controversial now because it's new science, and new science usually is big controversy, and then it works out what the real problem is later. But I think they're onto something. I think there is a big emission of carbon, and it's not emitted to the atmosphere, it's emitted to the surface waters of the ocean. But that's a problem because it reduces the gradient, the gradient down which CO2 can be taken up by the surface of the sea. See, so it will slow down the job that the ocean's doing for us in terms of uptake of CO2.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we have to go